The dominant voices of our time are often broken, flawed, destructive. Humans seem to be drawn like moths to the rhetoric of the arrogant, the scoundrel, the unjust. But if we let our feet travel a different path, a more ancient path, we find an unusual character with a different sound. A man called Jeremiah, a prophet, an artist, a performer even, a storyteller rooted in street theater, exciting symbols, powerful images. So what makes this man any different? Why should we listen to him? Because Jeremiah was good.
My name is Cam, and I'm going to read a scripture for us today. The words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, one of the priests of Anathoth in the territory of Benjamin. The word of the Lord came to him in the 13th year of the reign of Josiah, son of Ammon, king of Judah, and through the reign of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, down to the 5th month of the 11th year of Zedekiah, son of Josiah, king of Judah, when the people of Jerusalem went into exile. The word of the Lord came to me, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Alas, sovereign Lord, I said, I do not know how to speak. I'm too young. But the Lord said to me, Do not say I am too young. You must go to everyone I send you to, and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord. Then the Lord reached out his hand and touched my mouth, and said to me, I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over the nations and kingdoms, to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. This is the word of the Lord.
So the longest book in the Bible is a book called Jeremiah. It's called Jeremiah because it's about a man called Jeremiah. It's a very intense code. If you weigh all the verses, it is the longest single book in the whole of the Bible. If you actually kind of come to it and read it, you encounter something. It's a book of prophecy, a book about a man who brings what God says. Prophets, essentially what they do in the Hebrew tradition is they remind people about what God has said. People in those times found it easy to forget what God has said. So people would come along and God would remind them. And Jeremiah is a prophet, but he's a prophet that seems to love the spectacular. His images are his visuals, his symbols that he uses are often deeply loaded with emotion, with tension, with kind of profound ideas that we find. So as we dive into this book over the next few weeks, kind of inviting you into the work of an artist, the work of somebody who doesn't just come along and say things, but somehow acts it out. His behaviors, his being, his style tells us something. And what he seems to constantly be telling us, as many prophets do, is that God is trying to draw us to himself. No matter what our world is looking like, no matter what it is that we're currently encountering, God is drawing us to himself because he's there to be found. The book's about 2,600 years old. So there might be a part of you sits and says, wait a minute, we're in the 21st century. Why are we going to spend several weeks talking about a book that was written 2,600 years ago by a Hebrew prophet? Well, Jeremiah lived in a time that needed to hear from God. Jeremiah lived in a time where they had to kind of get a little bit of a grip as to what was going on. In Jeremiah's time, they lived in a world where you might want to say that kind of moral decay had taken over. That people's behaviors and people's way of being and people's general spiritual life was declining in a negative way. There was a lot of what you would call external religiosity. So people looked good. They turned up all the right places. They did all the right religious stuff. But actually, if you watched their life closely, there was very little evidence that these people were actually connected to God, that God's presence was with them. People in Jeremiah's time had kind of walked away from Scripture. They'd walked away from sort of God's way of guiding them. It was a time in Jeremiah's life where international conflict was high. Economic tensions between nations was particularly fraught. There was increased evidence both locally and globally in Jeremiah's time that the world and its leaders were out of sync with God's way of being. So, what you might say is that Jeremiah's time had pretty much nothing in common with our time. At all. But we figured, let's study this book anyway. No, actually, what we find, and perhaps Eugene Peterson words it well when he introduces us to this prophet, he says Jeremiah is the prophet of choice for many when we find ourselves having to live through difficult times. And we want some trustworthy help in knowing what to think, or how to pray, or how to carry on. Anyone who lives in disruptive times looks for companions who have been through them earlier, wanting to know how they went through it, how they made it, what it was like. Like, who do you turn to when everything you know gets smashed to pieces? You used to be confident about things, now you don't feel so confident. It used to feel like you knew the future, now you don't feel like you know the future. Maybe you never felt like you knew the future, but it seems even harder to imagine what it might be like. Jeremiah comes to us at that point, and he offers us a way of thinking, and a way of being, and a way of behaving that even 2,600 years later, I put to you, we'll find helpful, we'll find informative, will shape us and help us navigate our lives. The feeling that Jeremiah speaks to is of people who are in exile. We've talked about this before, but the biblical language of exile speaks to us even today because exile describes the sense of being where you don't want to be. And Jeremiah writes to a people who aren't where they want to be. Life hasn't worked out the way they imagined. The dreams that they have crumbled. The ideas of what they thought things were going to look like, it just doesn't look like that. And Jeremiah appears on the scene because in this very worst of times, Jeremiah realizes that people are doing something that's going to cause them even bigger problems. In the worst of times, they're also forgetting about how God has called them to be. And so the book begins. Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 1. You heard it read earlier in our service. The words of Jeremiah. The words of Jeremiah. How would you start a book like this? If you were called to write a book, if you decided, I'm going to write a long prophecy, if somebody commissioned you and said, the Bible needs a really long book, longer than all the others, how will you start it? I want to put it to you that you might not start it like this. I'm Jeremiah. My dad was Hilkiah. He was a priest in Anathoth in the territory of Benjamin. I know you guys were all studying this already this morning, so you're already up to date on all these places. But like if I was starting a really long book, I'd maybe have a little bit of intrigue at the start, you know, a little bit of kind of some plot twist in there, or just an explosion. You know, just something, just kind of bang, wow, like I got to hold on to this. This is going to be really exciting. Or maybe one of these, you know, like they do sometimes, where you have a little brief preview of what's coming, you know, in several months' time, and you know, you're then going to know the next 3 chapters are going to be sort of like flashback or stuff like that. But no, Jeremiah comes out. He goes, "Hey, I'm Jeremiah. This is who my dad was." Or what if you thought, okay, well, I've got to begin the letter like this, but I need to begin it in a particular shaped way. How would you describe yourself? If your job to begin this book required you to describe yourself, would you describe yourself like this? In the ancient world, names were really important. The name that you carried and where you came from and the family you were part of and how that family handled themselves, that was really important stuff because that's where your identity was found. Your identity was found in your roots. Your identity was found in your background and the people that you were related to. But if you were asked to describe who you are, as a contemporary person, would we use this sort of language? Would we talk in this sort of way? We could probably spend a lot of our life trying to wrestle through, how would I describe myself? But I wonder if for many of us, with our kind of modern autonomy, maybe we'd be uncomfortable with Jeremiah's way of saying. There's almost a part of me as a contemporary person wants to say, actually, I don't want to suggest that who my father was and what he did for a job and where I happened to be born, I kind of don't want to suggest that's overly important. There's a part of me, and as a contemporary person, wants to say there's way more important things to know about me. So if you had to describe all of the more important things about you, what would they be? And we have a tendency as contemporary people to say, well, there are things about me and what I do because I'm my own person. I'm an autonomous person. So I'll tell you about me, not about other people, not about people that have come before me, because that's not so important. But what would we replace it with? I'd venture a guess that for many of us in the contemporary context, we'd replace it with things that we do. You can kind of notice this notionally at parties that you go to. Like, I don't know about the parties that you go to, but the parties that I go to, and yes, pastors do occasionally get invited to parties. Generally when something's wrong at church and we need to talk about it. But when I go to parties, like people don't come up and go, hello, I am Bob. My father's name was John. He was a priest. He was from up north. People don't do that. What actually happens in parties in the contemporary culture is go, hey, this is John. This is what he does for a living. Have you noticed that that's the sort of thing we like to tell each other as we arrive? This is my job. This is what I do. And it makes me wonder, maybe we're not as autonomous as we think we are. Because actually where we locate ourselves is the place that we think value is found. And we obsess over our titles and our positions. We obsess over the idea that actually who I am and how I appear in public is really important. You get that job promotion and you're looking forward to the next party to go to because now I get to tell people what it is that I'm doing now. Or perhaps you book a fantastic vacation and it's amazing how easy that is to work into a regular conversation. Would you like a couple of squirts of pumpkin syrup in this? Do you know, for my vacation in a few weeks' time, I'm going to where they make pumpkin syrup. Like we can kind of work it in. You find yourself talking. I ran a race last weekend, and notice how I've just squeezed that into the conversation. It has nothing to do with anything that I'm talking about right now. But I've told everybody that I've met this week. So literally people that are just walking down the street. I'm like, you'll notice I'm walking a slight limp at the minute. It's because I ran 60 kilometers last weekend. And and you see how I did that? You see, and all of a sudden people, and you see, wait. No, my sermon doesn't work if you clap, right? My sermon, I'm trying to make a point here, people, that we work these things into our regular everyday life because we think they're the things that you need to know about me. My achievements, my attitude towards the job that I have. Have you ever noticed that we don't really care how good you are at your job? We just want to know that you have a good job title. This is my friend Bob. He's a bank manager. He's the worst bank manager in the history of bank managers. We never say that. This is my friend Bob. He's a bank manager. Terrible father. Because he's a great bank manager. He's never been at home for the kids. But because we're not interested in that. We're interested in he has a title that has prestige. I was hanging out with my friend Bob last week. He was a bank manager. I noticed that people don't say things like, I was hanging out with my friend Bob last week. He drives a garbage truck. That doesn't give me social prestige. That doesn't give me standing. And it's bizarre because we need garbage truck drivers, but yet somehow we've decided that doesn't have it. Because our public status is so much more important to us than our personal relationships. And so we would probably, as contemporary people, never begin the story of Jeremiah the way that Jeremiah does. We would want to roll out something more impressive. Because we like labels. We like them. We think they're healthy. We think they're good for us. But in a utilitarian way, our labels are actually maybe not so good for us because we now just assess everybody based on that particular value, and therefore we rank and compare people because of the labels that we have put on them. I have two things hanging on my wall in my office. Right? One of them is a certificate that says that at some point in my life I've passed a PhD exam and I get to call myself doctor. On the other side of my wall is a piece of propaganda that was done by a 5-year-old in crayon. And essentially it's a picture of a beach in Hawaii. And my 5-year-old gave this to me one day and said, this is where I want to go on vacation. And I keep both these things stuck on the wall. And it's fascinating that one piece seems to attract people to it. Oh, wow, you did a PhD. And I say, yes, I am a doctor. What's wrong right now? Can I prescribe something for you? I have friends who threaten me every time we go out. Don't dare ever put your hand up when somebody says, is there a doctor here? My doctor just uses Google, so I can do that. But on the other side is this piece of art, this crayoned piece of art that was done by a 5-year-old. This actually, if I'm honest, is more important to me. If my office went on fire, I would actually run to get that before I would run to get the certificate. Because actually it says something about me that's more important to me. It says something about who I am, and it says something about my family, and it says something about what I love. And yet so often it's the certificates that we push first and say, this is who I am. But the certificate doesn't actually tell you that much about me. Your job, your bank balance, the house that you live in, they probably say about as much about you as your passport photograph does or your fingerprint does. It's just that for some reason in our contemporary culture, we don't want to believe that. We want to believe that those things matter more. Do you ever wonder how much of your life you've spent wasting just worrying about how you are in comparison to somebody else? Do you ever wonder about how many hours you've whiled away thinking, what if I was somebody that I was not? What if I was someone else? What if I was just not me? The proverb says this in chapter 14 and verse 30, a heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones. You see, labels work for us when they're the good labels. When we have the labels we like, that actually is okay. When we got the job we want, and the house we want, and the career we want, and the title we want, and all our kids are lined up properly, we're kind of happy with that. When we're at the right university, when our school grades are the ones that we were hoping for, these labels work well for us. And therefore, we can ignore their destructive tendencies. But it's when the labels switch and the labels become ones that our society thinks are negative, we start to realize the dehumanizing nature of labels. That you are not a job title, that you are not a socioeconomic class. Why is it that being poor feels to be such a bad thing? Why is it that it carries more than just its physical challenges of being poor, but it also affects your social standing? It also affects your friendships. Have you noticed how often our own social groups always seem to navigate around similar socioeconomic classes? And we try to justify why that makes good sense, but it also carries a weird notion, if we're honest with ourselves, of what we're actually saying about people that are different from us. Because somebody's poorer than me, does it not mean that I can't learn something from them, that I shouldn't journey with them? And that's one of the beautiful things about church, is it dumps us all into this same room and says, maybe you can do something together. But when we put these negative labels on, we start to see their destructive tendencies. Oh, you're poor, or you're from the wrong part of town, or you're doing the wrong type of job. What about deeper labels? We see this constantly as society's becoming more alert to the nature of mental health challenges, for example. We start to talk about that a little more openly, but still we see there are people that I've met that have lost their jobs because of admitting that they're seeing a therapist. There are schools in our city that won't let children in because the children have been to see a therapist at some point, and therefore the school doesn't want to take a risk with a label like that. There are all sorts of places that you can find yourself where your mental history, your medical history, your identity, your gender, your ethnicity can all be things that people will use as labels to not see who the person is, but to see a label and treat you as such. It's fascinating in the biblical spectrum, what the Bible is constantly trying to call us towards is being fully human. And you notice how often the Bible tries to reject labels. It tries to draw us away from that and see each other as individuals and full humans. If we achieve something of what you would call full humanity, the biblical language to describe that is heaven. The Bible actually says it's heaven when people find themselves fully human. What does Jesus come to do? He says to give you full life. Ironically, when people are dehumanized, when people are labeled or numbered in its worst case scenario, what the Bible uses to describe that dehumanizing process is the language of hell. And so we find ourselves caught on this spectrum, and very often what we're doing to ourselves in contemporary society is pushing ourselves towards a hell on earth of numbers and labels as if those things really matter. And then what we do when we come back to Jeremiah is we can now do a bit of contrast work, because Jeremiah tells us, well, I'm Jeremiah. And he gives us language and labels that work in his time. I'm Jeremiah. This is who my father is. This is what my father does as a job. This is where we live. This is where we're from. Who are you? What do you do? Where do you come from? And then God enters the story. And God says to Jeremiah, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. Like Jeremiah, if he was a modern person, maybe he goes, hey, I'm Jeremiah, I'm a prophet. My bank balance is in good health. You should see the street that I live in. My car is this nice Tesla sat out here on the driveway because, he's an environmentalist. Or if Jeremiah is a Hebrew person, Jeremiah says, you know what, my name is Jeremiah, this is who my father is, this is where I'm from, this is what my father does as a job. They're all ways of locating ourselves in the story. And then God enters the story and he says, Jeremiah, do you think that's where the story begins? Forget Ancestry.com. God says, before I even formed you, and it was God that formed him, before I even formed you, I knew you. Jeremiah, all that he said about himself and all that I might say about myself and all that you might say about yourself pales into insignificance when God enters the fray and says, before you were even imagined, I had a knowledge of you. I knew you. Jeremiah has to learn that there's something about him that predates even him. Peterson phrases it like this. He says, before Jeremiah knew God, God knew Jeremiah. Now, if you'll let it then, this text has immense practical value for you in the 21st century. Particularly if you, as a classic person from the 21st century that happens to live in the Western world, if you'll allow me to use that the kind of slightly lazy language, particularly if you're prone to existential crises. Have you noticed that seems to be something that marks us in our contemporary world? What am I doing here, and what am I supposed to be doing? Our forefathers, they used to have this beautiful thing called a midlife crisis, where most of their life they had it figured out, and then for a few small years in the middle, you bought a toupee and a sports car. And then everything was okay, and then you kind of sold that later and got back on track with your life. It kind of feels like life has inverted for us in the contemporary context. If you speak to a 16-year-old or a 26-year-old or a 56-year-old, it feels like now most of us are holding out hope for just a few moments in the middle of life that make sense, because the rest of it, I have no idea. Forget midlife crisis, it's whole life crisis. Nothing's making sense to me. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. I don't know where I'm supposed to go, and I don't know how I'm supposed to do it. And I constantly find myself speaking to people, and that underlying existential uncertainty is very, very strong in us. And I wonder if Jeremiah helps us with this, because so much of this crisis, so much of this uncertainty about who I am and what I'm actually doing here comes because of one simple assumption. I assume that my story begins with me. I assume that I can work it out internally, that from myself I can work out who I am and what I'm supposed to do and what my purpose and passion and reason for being is. And so all of us are trying to work that out from ourselves. What should I be? What's good for me? What am I trying to become? How do I grow? How do I be what I'm supposed to be? Jeremiah discovers in this one sentence from God that actually he doesn't need to figure all of this out. God hasn't given him some puzzle. We imagine God sometimes, he just dumps us all these random pieces in front of us and goes, you figure it out. And we existentially find ourselves trying to make sense of it all as to what do I do with all these pieces and where do they all go? Jeremiah discovers that actually the secret to figuring his life out is resting in the knowledge that God knew him before he knew himself. The genius of Greek philosophy says, know yourself. The genius of Jeremiah's philosophy is know that you are known by God, and that before you even existed, God was figuring you out. So Jeremiah maybe just needs to lean in a little bit. He needs to lean into the God from whom all of his life develops. It's as if God and Jeremiah are having this conversation, and God goes, hey, Jeremiah, listen, by the time you got here, you were already ancient history. Think about that the next time you hold a baby. Get out, hold a baby as early as you can. Legally. And don't be great teaching, David, I'm going to the hospital, right? Okay, and just you get put in prison for stuff like that, okay? So, but hold a baby, and there's a temptation to kind of, I don't know, maybe, let me just confess my weirdness, but babies have a great smell, don't they? Just that kind of baby's head smell. I mean, that, we should sell that smell. It'd be so much more world peace. Just rub that on everybody before an election, and we'll all be friends. But you hold a baby, and there's a temptation to see all of the newness and all of the freshness and all of that. But Jeremiah's imagining this scene where you hold a baby and go, wow, this is old. Like, this is ancient, because even though I'm holding something minutes old, even though I'm aware of something that's only even been in existence for a few months, Jeremiah has to learn that God says, you are here well before all of this. So kind of chill out, Jeremiah, because I chose you. I wonder if we need to hear that today. I wonder if we need to hear that in our own lives. When all of the panic and the crisis takes over about what am I doing and where am I going and how do I make the choices about schools and universities and how do I make the choices about career and family, maybe sometimes we just need to chill out because we're trying to figure it out all by ourselves. God, also by the way, think about this then. So if God calls Jeremiah and says, oh, by the way, Jeremiah, you think that you're the son of some guy that is a priest that happens to live over there, and that might be true, but your story starts way before that. Like before you were even formed, I knew you. That also means that before Jeremiah got a chance to make a mess of everything, God had already chosen him. God had already called him. God had already set apart. Now, if you let it, that can be quite shaping for your life. That could even be quite formative for how you make decisions. Because so often our narrative is, well, I can't do X or Y because I previously did A or B. And because I did this, that, and the next thing, I'm now excluded from all of these options of things over here. And so often in the world, that's how life works. That these bad choices here affect these choices over here. But if God can choose Jeremiah before Jeremiah even exists, then that seems to suggest that anything that Jeremiah does isn't overly impacting on what God has called Jeremiah to do. It essentially seems that in God's grace economy, what Jeremiah does with his life might still be covered by what God has done. So often it seems that we think, well, once I get it all together, then God can use me. But before you were even formed, Jeremiah's being told, before you were even formed, before you were an idea, before anybody imagined you, before anyone imagined your parents, God had some thoughts about what you could be. And nothing you can do can change God's mind on that. Which of course makes Jeremiah's response even more hilarious, because on the back of this whole conversation, Jeremiah responds, I don't really know how to speak very well because I'm only young. Classic biblical conversation, by the way. God drops just this profound philosophy. The text brings you to this beautiful idea of being and belonging, and then humans invariably just say the first dumb thing that comes to their mind. I'm too young. Moses is like, oh, I'm not really good at speaking. Gideon's like, you should see my family. We're a total mess and very weak. We can't do anything. David comes in smelling a sheep. You know, this is just the biblical story. And what we seem to so often want to do is we want to roll our inadequacies. Here's the reason that I can't do what I was purposed for. Here's the reason that I can't fulfill what it is that God has formed me for. I'm not talking about potential. I'm talking about who you were made to be. I'm talking about purpose. And Jeremiah comes along and God gives him purpose and says, remember, this is what I've called you to be. This is what I've built you for. And Jeremiah goes, no, I can't do that. I'm too young. Like, we love leaning on our inadequacies. They're convenient, they're helpful, but they're always excuses when it comes to God's economy. Perhaps a question that we need to reflect on when we engage with a text like Jeremiah is there a gap between what I think I am and what God thinks I am? Is there a gap between what I think I can do and what God thinks I can do? Is there a gap between what I was made for and what I'm doing? And what are the excuses that I'm giving for that gap? Complete the sentence for your own life. What's your I am to? Jeremiah's word is young. What's your word? Because you probably have a word. I know I have a word. And then maybe I have several words at certain points in my life where here are the reasons that I'm not doing the things that I know I'm probably built to do. Here are the excuses that I'm giving. And I think if we took the time to reflect, many of us would admit that we're rolling out excuses that lean on our inadequacies and not on the God who has built us and made us. Of course, God's response is brilliant. God's response is one of relevancy. Like what's your age got to do with anything, Jeremiah? Now, Jeremiah's probably 16 at this point. And then you want to remember that over the next few weeks as we're talking through this series. Remember that this is, for a good chunk of this story, it's a 16-year-old. And that's quite remarkable because in those days, like people that were older didn't really like listening to what 16-year-olds had to say. And in those days. And And I'm not sure how well they would have taken to a 16-year-old turning up and saying, hey, I'm here to tell you where you've got it all wrong and how God wants you to put it right. So this series will, if you'll let it, just really help you with your teenage relationships in your life. Like when your teenagers are causing you problems, just remember this. Like, just be thankful that God didn't make them Jeremiah. And teenagers, if you're in a real tough time with your parents, just remember there's still a chance that God might call you to put them right. Well, you thought that was less funny. I am young, Jeremiah says. That's right. You are young. But God says, don't say that, though. Why not say that? Well, because it's got nothing to do with you, Jeremiah. What does your age have to do with everything, anything? You're called to say my words. You're called to do what I tell you to do. So it's not that Jeremiah is turning up and going, hey, I have some thoughts that I've been working out over my experienced life. It's not like Jeremiah is turning up going, here's some things I want to share with you that I've been really meditating on for the last decade. No, God says, you are the person who I've called to go, but I'm going to give you what I need you to say. It strikes me that it's God choosing us that qualifies us, and not our qualifications that cause God to choose us. God doesn't choose you because of what you've done. God doesn't choose you because of all the things that you've managed to amass in the course of your life. Because remember, God chose you before you were even formed. God called you and brought you in and started to purpose you before you were even dreamed of. And all of this kind of gets to us at this moment right here in our lives if we'll let it. Because here am I with a past. And my past has complexities. It has high points and it has low points. It has successes and it has failures. It has a lot of inadequacies. It has a lot of insecurities. It has good times and it has bad times. And maybe if you're anything like me, there are moments in your life, and sometimes those moments are more frequent than other moments, where you look at somebody else and go, if only my life could be their life. Or if you look at something else and think, if only that could be my story. If I had a different life or a different partner or a different job or a different family or a different body, all of these things, if they were different, I could perhaps live the life I'm supposed to live. And this is a constant trap that we find ourselves in, I think, in our contemporary world. But people have always found themselves in this trap. That you can spend a lot of your life worrying about what you're not. You can spend a lot of time thinking about the things that you aren't. But the obsession with that will always hinder you from answering the question that actually matters, which is the question of who am I actually? And who you are is far more interesting to God and to your friends and to your family and to your city. Far more interesting than who you're not. Who you're not is a boring subject. It's not worth your energy, and it's not worth your time. And remember, God says this in the midst of it all. I don't know if you spotted it in verse 5. God says to Jeremiah, I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Quite literally, the Hebrew here is, I gave you as a prophet to the nations. Wait a minute here. So I formed you, but before I formed you, I knew you. And before you were even formed, I had already given you a job. I mean, before Jeremiah is even a human, God is violating his human rights. Before you even existed, I had a plan of what you were going to do, and I gave you to it. Like, well, do I get a say in this? Is Jeremiah? Do I get a? He would be forgiven for thinking that, right? Like, wait a minute, where's my autonomy? Where's my own agency in this? I get to make my own decisions with what I do with my life. But again, I wonder if in this simple comment, I gave you to this, Jeremiah, maybe we find the truth of one of our problems with identity. Is that most of our quest for identity involves the improvement of ourselves. How do I grow? How do I become? How do I get it all together so that I can be what I'm supposed to be? And we begin from the assumption that we must amass things, knowledge and possessions and status. And in the amassing of these things, we'll reach that place where it all makes sense for us. And we persist with this year on year, despite the fact that we see all these people who seem to amass all those things and still don't seem to have it quite figured out. And God says to Jeremiah, I gave you to something. What if perhaps the truth of the quest for identity isn't found in what you can get, but in what you can give? What if it's found in being given? What if somewhere rooted into the nature of being human is that we are actually better at giving than we are at receiving? How did God save the world? Well, we've been learning that story since we were little kids. In John 3:16, it says he gave his son, Jesus. Like, how do that make sense? He didn't gather it to himself, he gave things away. Paul says to the Philippians when he writes to them that his life is poured out on their behalf. So what if it's possible that God has called us, as in the same way as he's called Jeremiah, to actually give things away? That maybe my identity is found not in what I can do for myself, but what I do for others. Maybe my identity and my purpose and my reason for existence is found not in trying to keep it all for me, but in actually being willing to give some of that away. God says, Jeremiah, I gave you. God doesn't come to Jeremiah and go, hey, let's do this, Jeremiah. Let's try and figure out who you are. Let's just do a few sessions together, and I got a couple of tests you'll take, and you can find whether you're a 1 through to a 9, and depending which one you are, we'll be able to make sense of the type of person you are. And then once we've got that done, we'll find out if you're I and an N or a T and a J, and if we can mess that with the 7, then we'll come up with an ideal career for your body type. But God doesn't do this to Jeremiah. Instead, he says, I made you, and this is what I made you for. Now, do you want to live in that? Do you want to do that? Jeremiah still has a choice. Jeremiah still has his autonomy, but his choice is be what God made him to be or be something else. I get asked this question quite a lot, and I appreciate people asking me it, right? So please, if you've asked me this question, don't feel bad. But a lot of people come to me quite regularly and say, hey, do you like it here? And the level of this question being asked to me goes up as it gets colder. And, you have a week where there's a bit of snow, a couple of thunderstorms, a tornado, some hail, like kind of regular July. And then people seem to come to me at church afterwards and go, do you like it here? And I think I know what you're inquiring about. It's, in terms of when you ask that question. But it also strikes me as a very interesting question to ask. In fact, it's an interesting question for us to ask anybody. Do we like it here? Because I'm tempted to think, although it's a nice question, and I do understand why we ask the question, it's the wrong question for us to ask. It's the wrong question for us to ask of each other. And I think if we learn from Jeremiah, the question is not, do you like it where you are? The question is not, do you like where you found yourself right now? The question from Jeremiah seems to be, is this where God has given you? And are you okay with that? Has God placed you here? Has God called you here? Has God designed you for this? Do you feel at this point in your life you're able to give yourself to what you were shaped and purposed and built for? And are you okay with that? And see, I think it doesn't matter whether you were born here or whether you flew here. That seems to be the question which would serve us well to spend some time answering. If God built us, shaped us, planned us, and purposed us, are we okay with the way that has turned out? Let me pray for you this morning. I simply want to say that may you, like Jeremiah, may you learn that identity is not found within yourself, but in understanding that you were known, planned, and loved before you were even imagined. Before anybody knew of you, before you were formed, that God loved you, knew you, and planned you and purposed you. And that the God that did this has placed you and given you to your community, to your city, to your culture. So may you continue to behave in a way that is formed and shaped by this knowledge. And may you also remember, as Jeremiah learned and continued to learn, may you remember there's no need to be afraid of this because God is always, always with you. And may his grace and peace be with you this week. Amen and amen.